In the cold dawn of November 1916, Private Thomas J. Williams huddled deeper into his greatcoat, trying to ward off the biting chill that seeped through every fiber of his being. The trench, a labyrinth of mud and despair, stretched for miles on either side, a scar across the once serene landscape of the Western Front. The war had raged for 2 long years, and the men of the 5th Infantry Division had become grimly accustomed to the harsh realities of trench warfare. The air was thick with the stench of decaying bodies, unwashed soldiers, and the omnipresent mud that clung to everything. Rats, bloated from feasting on the dead, scurried along the trench floor, indifferent to the human suffering around them. The trench itself was a marvel of military engineering, with sandbags and wooden planks reinforcing the walls, yet it offered little comfort or protection from the relentless artillery bombardments. Williams glanced at the men around him, their faces ghostly in the pre-dawn light. Corporal Jenkins, with whom he had shared a tent back in training camp, was unrecognizable now, his eyes hollow and distant. Nearby, Lieutenant Harding was poring over a map, his brow furrowed in concentration. They all knew that another push was imminent. The High Command had ordered an advance, and it was up to them to take the enemy's position. The signal came at dawn. Whistles pierced the air, and the men clambered up the ladders, emerging from their muddy sanctuary into the no-man's land. The ground was a hellscape of craters and barbed wire, with the eerie silence of the early morning shattered by the roar of artillery. Williams moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest, every step a battle against the sucking mud that threatened to pull him down. Machine gun fire raked the advancing soldiers, cutting down men like wheat before a scythe. Williams ducked and weaved, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Around him, comrades fell, their cries of agony lost in the cacophony of war. He reached a crater and flung himself into it, gasping for breath. In the chaos, he spotted Jenkins crawling towards him, his leg a bloody mess. "Help me, Tom!" Jenkins gasped, his voice barely audible over the din. Williams reached out, grabbing Jenkins by the collar and pulling him into the crater. He ripped a strip of cloth from his uniform and tied it around Jenkins's leg, trying to staunch the flow of blood. The moments stretched into eternity as they huddled together, the battle raging around them. As the morning wore on, the initial surge of adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. The ground was littered with the dead and dying, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the sickly sweet scent of death. Williams knew they had to keep moving, had to push forward or risk being pinned down and annihilated. He hauled Jenkins to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled towards the enemy trench. The German line was closer now, and the defenders were throwing everything they had at the advancing British forces. Williams fired his rifle, the recoil jarring his already aching shoulder. He felt a searing pain in his side but ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. Finally, they reached the German trench. Williams threw himself over the parapet, dragging Jenkins with him. The trench was chaos, with soldiers locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Williams swung his rifle like a club, driving back the enemy. In the midst of the fighting, he saw Lieutenant Harding, his face grim and determined, leading the charge. By some miracle, they held the trench. The Germans fell back, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Williams collapsed against the trench wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Jenkins lay beside him, his face pale but alive. They had survived another day, but the cost was staggering. As night fell, Williams stared out into the darkness, wondering how much more they could endure. The war had taken so much from them already, but he knew they had to keep fighting. For their comrades, for their families, and for a future free from the horrors of the trenches.